The woman was found dead in her own apartment, and from the very beginning of the investigation this case seemed very strange. The only serious evidence was the bite left by the attacker on the victim's body. It took the police more than 20 years to finally find out the terrible truth, but this turn of events caused a lot of discontent and criticism, because no one expected such a denouement. Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957 in Washington state. She grew up in a large, friendly family. She had 2 sisters and loving parents. They later moved to Tucson, Arizona, where Sherri attended a local school. The girl studied excellently and even graduated from primary school a year earlier than her peers. Sherri completed the entire 7th grade program on her own during the summer holidays after 6th grade. After graduating from school in 1973, she entered the California College, where her older sister was already studying at that time. During her first year, Sherri decided to get a medical degree and become a nurse, for which she had to enroll in additional courses at another educational institution. After graduating from college, Sherri decided to get a master's degree at Los Angeles State University, and also got a job there as a nurse to pay for her studies on her own. After she received her master's degree at 23, her father bought her an apartment in the Los Angeles suburbs, but Sherri did not want to live off her parents, so she wrote her father checks for the entire amount of the mortgage payments every month. She also got a job at a local hospital, heading the nursing department for the care of seriously ill people. In May 1984, when Sherri was 26 years old, she met a man named John Rutten. There was immediate sympathy between them, and the couple began dating. John had a good education, worked as a computer engineer, and was a very intelligent young man. A year later, the couple decided to get married, and after that John moved into Sherri's apartment. The newlyweds honeymooned in Jamaica before returning home to celebrate Christmas with their family. Sherri thought that a happy and carefree future awaited this couple. On the morning of February 24 of the following year, John was getting ready for work as usual. Sherri said she wasn't feeling well and decided to stay home. She asked John to call her in a few hours, and the man left for work at about 7:20. Closer to 10 a.m., John tried to call her, but the woman did not answer the phone. Half an hour later he tried again, but there was still no answer. Then the man called her at work and asked if she was on shift. However, Sherri did not appear at the hospital either. Her sister also tried to call her, but received no answer. John returned home from work at about 6 p.m. and immediately noticed something strange. The garage door was open, although he had closed it in the morning. Sherri's car was missing, so the man's first thought was that she had gone somewhere. At the entrance to the garage, he saw a large amount of broken glass and immediately discovered it above the garage. There was a small balcony with glass doors that were broken. The man entered the house through the garage and, to his horror, found Sherri there. She was lying on the floor. Her body was severely disfigured. John immediately called the police, and detectives began examining the crime scene. All the rooms were in complete disorder: broken vases, overturned furniture, scattered things. A bloody handprint was found on the wall next to the alarm button. Apparently, the victim tried to reach her, but she failed. In addition to extensive bruises and wounds, experts noticed a human bite on Sherri's wrist. In addition to all of the above, marks on her hands indicated that the attacker had tied up the victim and then removed the ropes. The cause of death was 3 gunshot wounds made almost at point-blank range. Detectives found a blanket with bullet holes in the apartment and concluded that the assailant had wrapped a gun in it to muffle the sound of gunfire. Detectives immediately concluded that there had been a prolonged struggle between the assailant and Sherri. This was evidenced by the number of scattered and broken things throughout the apartment, as well as a bloody print next to the alarm button. The lead investigator on the case quickly concluded that they were dealing with a robbery gone wrong. In his opinion, at least 2 criminals got into Sherri's apartment, but they did not expect the woman to be at home. A struggle ensued between them, and Sherri fought for her life to the last. Several facts supported the robbery version. First, Sherri's car disappeared from the garage. Second, someone had stacked stereo equipment and a record player next to the stairs leading to the 2nd floor. According to the police, the robbers wanted to carry him out and leave, but after a scuffle and murder, they fled the place. However, there were some dubious aspects to this version. Firstly, the police found no signs of forced entry. This meant that either Sherri herself let the criminals in, or they had the key. In addition, the attackers did not touch absolutely all valuables, including a jewelry box that was in a prominent place. Detectives interviewed all of Sherri's neighbors. However, this did not bring any new leads. Some residents heard sounds of a fight, but no gunshots. They also did not see anyone enter the woman's apartment. Experts took blood samples and fingerprints from the house, but they were unable to conduct DNA testing in 1985. The chief investigator also took a piece of cotton wool and used it to blot the bite mark on Sherri's body. He hoped that the attacker's saliva might remain there, and sooner or later experts would be able to use this evidence to catch the killer. After a detailed search of the apartment, detectives learned one interesting fact. It turned out that the criminals took only one thing: Sherri and John's marriage certificate. This was very strange and cast suspicion on the man himself. But his alibi turned out to be unconditional. John was at work until the evening and he simply did not have the opportunity to commit this crime. In addition, he himself informed the police about the loss of this document. Detectives were never able to find an explanation for this strange fact, as well as new clues. A week and a half later, they found Sherri's car in a parking lot located 4 kilometers from her apartment. It was open and the keys were in the ignition. Forensic experts tried to find fingerprints, but they were unsuccessful. Either the criminals touched it exclusively with gloves, or they erased all the prints. 2 months after the murder, just a few hundred meters from Sherri's house, a robbery occurred. Detectives immediately found many similarities. 2 criminals entered someone else's apartment through the garage, threatened the owner with a pistol and stole stereo equipment. The chief investigator immediately thought that these 2 were behind the woman's murder, so the police tried to find them. According to witnesses, they compiled rough sketches of the suspects, and also learned that both men were Hispanic. But they were never found. However, the investigators showed little desire to get to the bottom of the truth, which constantly irritated Sherri's parents. Her father regularly went to the police station, inquired about the progress of the investigation and asked detectives to consider different leads. One day he even asked to take a closer look at John's ex-girlfriend named Stephanie Lazarus, who was herself a police officer. Sherri told her father several times that Stephanie was obsessed with John, but investigators only laughed at this version. They told the man to watch less detective series. The point was that Stephanie couldn't come to terms with John leaving. Having learned that he was going to marry another woman, she came to Sherri's work. Stephanie told her that their marriage was doomed and she and John would get back together sooner or later. In addition, she said that John slept with her after his engagement to Sherri. Of course, after this visit, Sherri was very upset. Returning home, she told John what had happened, and he admitted that he had indeed slept with Stephanie. After she found out about his engagement, the girl in tears asked him to come, talked about her love and persuaded him to return to her. But John said that he loved Sherri and intended to marry her. Then Stephanie asked him to sleep with him one last time, and John agreed. He apologized to Sherri and said that it was a huge mistake on his part. The woman forgave him, and this incident with Stephanie was gradually forgotten. But the story didn't end there. Stephanie came to their home several times unannounced under various pretexts. One day she came with a set of skis and said that John promised her to wax them. The next time she entered the apartment when the man was not at home. Sherri didn't even hear her enter the room and was shocked to see Stephanie in her living room. When asked what she was doing here, the woman stated that she had come to talk to John. Sherri had a hard time convincing her to leave. Later, she even thought about going to the police about this incident, but did not do so. The woman was afraid that if she spoke about harassment by their own employee, they would simply laugh at her. She also wondered how Stephanie managed to get into the apartment complex. It was surrounded by a high fence, and to enter you had to have a special pass. Apparently the woman was using her police badge and security was letting her through. As for the apartment itself, Stephanie should have had a duplicate key. Otherwise, she simply would not have been able to get in there without breaking the lock. In addition, Sherri repeatedly noticed that someone was following her. One day she and John were sitting in a restaurant, and the woman saw someone staring at them. As soon as she looked at this man, he immediately left. Sherri couldn't see his face because it was covered by the hood. Their home phone also received regular calls. The strangers simply remained silent on the phone, and Sherri admitted that it could be Stephanie. The victim's father told detectives about all these incidents, but they did not attach any significance to his words. They were sure that the two Mexicans who robbed the apartment not far from Sherri's house were behind the murder. 3 months after the murder, something interesting happened. Several documents related to Sherri's case disappeared from the police department, including detectives' notes on the investigation. They had to record almost every step they took in connection with the investigation of this crime. But at one point the police simply could not find these magazines. However, there was still no important clues there. Since then, the case has been stalled for years, with detectives showing little desire to look for new leads, despite constant pressure from Sherri's parents. 8 months after the murder, her father offered a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the culprit's identification. A year later, he spoke at a press conference where he again promised a reward for information, but in both cases this did not bring any results. 7 years later, the lead investigator on Sherri's case resigned. The victim's father decided to meet with his successor, hoping that he would take his job more seriously. In addition, it was 1993, and DNA analysis technologies were already actively used by the police in solving crimes. Sherri's father asked the detective to conduct such a test and even offered to pay for it in full, but the detective said that this made no sense since they did not have a single suspect to compare the resulting DNA profile with. Meanwhile, John started a new family, but at some point he got back together with Stephanie. They were planning to go to Hawaii together, but before that something unusual happened. The man called the detectives and asked if they had any new evidence pointing to Stephanie's involvement. Apparently, he himself assumed that the woman could do something similar. But all these years I was afraid to say about it. However, this did not stop him from having an intimate relationship with her again. As for Stephanie herself, she was rapidly moving up the police career ladder. The woman received higher ranks, twice became Detective of the Year and had an impeccable reputation. She also married another police officer, but that didn't stop her from sleeping with John regularly. In 2001, a separate unit was formed in Los Angeles to deal with unsolved murders. Sherri's case was handed over to them, along with thousands of similar cases, and detectives began to gradually sort through them. They quickly studied each case, trying to understand which ones had the greatest chance of being solved. For example, murders without any evidence were postponed to the very end of the queue, and cases with DNA samples of possible criminals were flagged as the most promising. Sherri's murder was included in this list, since among the evidence was a piece of cotton wool, which could contain the criminal's saliva left after a bite. 2 years later, detectives took up the case and sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Due to the high workload, they had to wait almost 2 years for results, until January 2005. Among this evidence were fragments of fingernails and blood samples from the apartment. All of them contained only Sherri's own DNA, and criminologists could only study a sample from the bite site on her body. The problem was that the flask with this evidence could not be found for a whole day, until it was eventually discovered near the wall of a large refrigerator. After examining the sample, experts found foreign DNA that belonged to an unknown woman. This profile was immediately checked against the FBI database, but it was not there. Detectives assumed that this woman could have committed the robbery in tandem with another criminal, or that 2 robbers had gotten into Sherri's apartment. Investigators remained convinced that the murder occurred during a robbery, so they did not consider any other versions. After they failed to find a single new lead in this direction, the matter went into overdrive. This continued until February 2009. Then a new detective took over Sherri's case and began studying materials left by other investigators. Seeing that the DNA of another woman was found at the site of the bite on the victim's body, he doubted the version of the robbery. Detectives admitted that the motives for this crime could be completely different. So they decided to compile a list of all the women who could potentially be connected to Sherri's murder. As a result, they were able to collect 5 names, including Stephanie, a work colleague of the victim, and 3 other girls. The detective initially doubted Stephanie's involvement, given her reputation and successful police career. For this reason, he first decided to check the remaining suspects. Together with other investigators, he quickly came to the conclusion that the 3 women on this list had nothing to do with Sherri's death, they had no motive and had an alibi. After that, they started checking on the nurse Sherri was working with. The case file indicated that the relationship between them was quite tense, and the police secretly obtained a DNA sample from the trash she threw out. Experts extracted the profile and determined that it did not match the saliva found at the site of the bite. That left detectives with only one suspect left, Stephanie. He and several other colleagues agreed to keep this information secret until they managed to obtain serious evidence or refute this version. None of them wanted to accuse a police officer with an impeccable reputation of murder, and Stephanie could easily destroy their careers using her connections. They began secretly collecting information on her, trying to find at least some connection with the murder. It is noteworthy that the woman worked in the same building as them on the same floor. Because of this, investigators had to take many precautions and not even mention her name in their records. Detectives soon discovered their first interesting fact. During the years of the murder, Stephanie owned a .38 caliber revolver, the same one used to shoot Sherri. They also learned that the victim had repeatedly complained of strange and even aggressive behavior on the part of Stephanie. The fact that a police officer would show up at Sherri's place of work in his uniform and say rude things to her seemed suspicious. Adding even more suspicion was the fact that Stephanie entered Sherri's gated community and even her apartment several times. After analyzing reports and photographs from the crime scene, detectives came to the conclusion that the possible robbery seemed staged. They didn't even take jewelry from the apartment, which was lying in the most visible place, but instead they just prepared a player and stereo for takeaway. Moreover, the shooter had to have a good understanding of how the weapon works in extreme conditions. He was able to wrap a blanket around the barrel of the gun so that the neighbors did not hear a single shot. It is unlikely that a low-grade thief of iPods could have such skills, but a trained and experienced police officer could. Another factor pointing to Stephanie's involvement was the marriage license stolen from Stephanie's apartment. Why would some stranger robbers look for this piece of paper and take it with them, leaving behind a whole box of jewelry? But Stephanie clearly had this motive. She was in love with John and could not accept the fact that he married someone else. The marriage certificate could have quite a tangible symbolic meaning for her. Perhaps it was not enough for her to simply kill Sherri, or she initially planned to enter her apartment just for this document, but the woman caught her stealing. Finally, detectives learned that 2 weeks after the murder, Stephanie came to the police department and wrote a statement about the theft. According to this information, someone broke into her car, which was parked near the pier, and stole several things: a gym bag, clothes, videotapes and a .38 caliber revolver. Considering all the above facts, the moment with the gun seemed very suspicious. Detectives assumed that she deliberately got rid of the weapon, framing it all as a theft. Moreover, she filed a complaint at another police station, where no one knew her. It also seemed strange, since her colleagues would be more likely to handle the matter with the utmost responsibility. As a result, detectives decided to obtain a DNA sample from Stephanie. Several undercover officers followed the woman for a week until they finally got their chance. On May 28, 2009, Stephanie and her adopted daughter stopped for lunch at a cafe. Once they left, the officers took the glass the woman had been drinking from and sent it to the laboratory. The next day the result was ready, a complete coincidence. Even though many factors pointed to Stephanie's involvement, detectives were still shocked. It was difficult for them to believe that a high-ranking and respected police officer was involved in the murder, but the results of the DNA examination were undeniable. However, at that time they had no time for these thoughts. The investigators began to develop a plan to arrest the woman. None of them wanted to do this in the middle of a police station in front of hundreds of officers. In addition, Stephanie had extensive connections, and the detectives decided to lure her away from prying eyes. The head of the Los Angeles Police Department was unofficially informed that one of his subordinates was suspected of murder. The supervisor ordered detectives not to approach Stephanie while she was carrying a service weapon or sidearm. He also considered it risky to arrest her in her own home, since the woman lived with her husband and adopted daughter. The detectives began to think about how they could get the man above them to surrender his weapon, and soon they had a great idea. In the basement of the police station there were prison cells designed to temporarily hold criminals, so anyone entering there had to lay down their weapons. To lure her there, a legend was invented. Stephanie had extensive experience working in a department that dealt with art thefts. So on June 5, 2009, two detectives wearing hidden microphones approached her and asked for help. They said they had arrested a suspect who may have information about the stolen paintings. Detectives admitted that they had little understanding of all this and needed the help of an experienced professional. Stephanie agreed and went with them to the basement where the suspect was supposedly supposed to be kept. After the woman surrendered her weapon, they went to the interrogation room, but no suspect was there. Instead, the detectives began gradually and carefully laying their cards on the table, asking Stephanie questions about Sherri's murder. At first they simply said that they needed to ask her some questions about an old case involving her ex-boyfriend. Over the course of an hour, they gradually led the dialogue to a discussion of the murder itself, but Stephanie said that she hardly remembered Sherri, because all this was a very long time ago. Finally, detectives announced that they had managed to obtain the killer's DNA and asked Stephanie to provide her sample for comparison. At this point, the woman immediately said that she did not intend to donate her DNA, refused to talk further without a lawyer and decided to leave. The detectives let her go, but several police officers with handcuffs were already waiting for Stephanie at the end of the hallway. 23 years after the murder, the woman was arrested. Given Stephanie's extensive police experience, all attempts to get her to talk during interrogations did not lead to any result. She knew very well the odds against her. DNA from the bite had been found on the victim's body, and it was extremely difficult to challenge this evidence. However, she denied any involvement and maintained her innocence. As a result, the detectives had no choice but to prepare documents to submit to the court. Over the next few years, Stephanie was held in a women's prison until the first hearings began in 2012. It took the police 3 years to rebuild this case virtually from scratch. Due to the fact that their predecessors blindly believed in a botched robbery, it was necessary to redo all the materials and focus specifically on Stephanie. At the trial, the woman continued to insist on her innocence. Her lawyer questioned the results of the DNA test, and also pointed out that during the initial investigation there was no suspicion against Stephanie. But all these arguments seemed completely unconvincing. The prosecution believed that on that day, Stephanie waited until John left for work and entered Sherri's apartment. She went up to the second floor and shot her once, but Sherri was able to fight her off and a struggle ensued that spilled over to the first floor. Ultimately, Stephanie killed her and vandalized the apartment, creating the illusion of a robbery. Next, she found the marriage certificate and left the place. After the arrest, detectives found out that Stephanie had boasted to her colleagues about her set of master keys, and in her house they found several books on how to pick locks. This could explain how she got into the apartment without leaving any signs of forced entry. A poor quality lock can be opened using master keys without any expert noticing any traces. The trial ended on March 8 of that year, with the jury finding Stephanie guilty of murder. She received 27 years to life in prison, plus an additional 2 years for using a service pistol. At the same time, the judge deducted 1,000 days from her sentence, citing time spent behind bars awaiting trial and good behavior. Sherri's parents tried to sue the detectives who originally worked on the case. It turned out that the victim's father had been telling them to take a closer look at Stephanie from day one, but they ignored his words. And here a completely reasonable question arose: were they purposefully covering up for their colleague, or did they really not believe in her involvement? In the first case, it would be a serious crime, and in the second, it would be simple negligence and ignorance of compelling facts. Unfortunately, in this case, the statute of limitations was in effect, and the court refused to initiate proceedings against these police officers. As for Stephanie, immediately after the trial she filed an appeal, but it was quickly rejected. She still denies her guilt while behind bars. She is currently 62 years old, and she will be able to apply for early release only in 2039. Sherri's ex-husband, John, lost interest in investigating her murder almost immediately after the incident. He started a new family, dated Stephanie for some time, and later moved to another city. Detectives wondered about his involvement, but that theory seemed unlikely. Most likely, he did not know about his ex's plans. Thus, this case might still be collecting dust in the archives if it had not fallen into the hands of professional detectives. Everyone who had worked on it before refused to even consider the possibility that their colleague was involved. Share your opinion about this story in the comments and don't forget to like the video if you liked it. Thank you for watching.